I'm Hannah.
And I'm Georgia.
And you're listening to Film Picnic.
We begin as always by acknowledging that Film Picnic is recorded on the ancestral lands of the Musqueam peoples. This land was not given up freely and is referred to as unceded territory, and it continues to be home for the Indigenous communities from which it is stolen.
It is with immense privilege that we talk into these microphones and share our stories, as stories have been shared for generations before us on this land. We hope that Film Picnic can be a space for shared accountability, knowledge sharing, and reconciliation. This always was and always will be Indigenous land.
Lovely. We have two very special guests with us here today. I'm going to introduce the first one. Lyana Patrick is an award-winning Vancouver-based director, writer, and researcher from the Stalatin First Nation. Committed to elevating Indigenous stories, she studied film at the Native Voices program at the University of Washington. Her acclaimed short films, A Place to Belong and The Train Station, have been showcased at prestigious festivals like Hot Docs, Doc NYC, and the Vancouver International Film Festival, earning her recognition for her powerful, community-centered storytelling. Lyana, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yay!
Our second very special guest is Jessica Hallenbeck, another award-winning documentary filmmaker and owner and co-founder of Lantern Films, where I work, founded in 2015 out of a desire to make critically important and visually stunning documentaries. With an undergraduate degree in media and film from Queen's University, a master's degree in community planning, and a PhD in geography, Jessica has worked in the documentary world for close to 20 years. Her producing credits include the Knowledge Network series Behind the Facade, New Hulk Radio, directed by Banshee Hanous, and the feature documentary The Empress of Vancouver, directed by Dave Rodenshort. Thank you so much for being here, Jess.
Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us on your show.
Yay!
Amazing. For those who may not know, we have today our guests, the writer, director, and executive producer of Nechako, It Will Be a Big River Again.
The Nechako stretches for over 500 kilometers of British Columbia, Canada, and connects me to the lands and waters where generations of my people have lived. Nechako means big river in the Dakhelk language. But in the 1950s, the river was dammed to power an aluminum smelter, leaving our nations in crisis. This is the story of our 70-year-long fight against Rio Tinto Alcan, against two levels of government. And it's also a story of the people, including my dad, who have dedicated their lives to save the Nechako.
For our listeners who maybe haven't seen the film, does either one of you want to give us a quick synopsis of what it is?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So the film documents the 70-year-long fight that the Nechako nations have waged to reclaim and restore the Nechako River. So the story centers around a court case, or it's kind of the entry point into that history that the nations have against Rio Tinto Alcan. In the 1950s, the Aluminum Company of Canada, Alcan, dammed the Nechako and diverted 70% of it. So it impacted our waterways, it impacted our fish, it impacted our many different aspects of our lives. So the film tells that story, and it also provides snapshots of how we continue to use and occupy our lands and waters, and about those relationships that we have to lands and waters.
Yeah, in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
Hannah and I were lucky enough to see the film.
We saw the premiere at Dockside. It was incredible, and the reception was also incredible. I think it touched everybody, and you could see by the conversations that were happening after that it really got the wheels turning, which I'm assuming is your intention behind this documentary. I'm curious how this concept initially came to be for you, Lyana, and how it came to you as well, Jess. I know you are a member of the nation and the community. Was it something that you'd been talking about for a while?
Can I pass this over to
Please.
Jessica?
Yes.
Because really, it started actually with the chief of SICAs reaching out to Jessica.
Oh.
But it does go back further than that.
It goes back further than that.
I mean, I think that this idea of a film that was about the dam, that was about the river, that was about primitive accumulation, but also cumulative impacts, had been circulating for a long time. So Lyana, I remember when your dad was chief, we had a conversation about making a film at that point. Yeah. And then that conversation there wasn't momentum at that time. And then I got contacted by Chief Priscilla Mueller from SICAs, and she had heard, I guess she had kind of been asking around about somebody who might be interested and able to make a film about the court case. And she got my name from Mitchell McCook. I had worked with Mitch on a film. Mitch is from SICAs, and he's also from McLeod Lake. And we had worked together on a film called Quadacha by the River. That was about the Bennett Dam and its impact on a community in northern BC, Fort Ware, also known as Quadacha. And so Mitch is the one that kind of gave Priscilla my name, and I met her in early 2019. And at that point then reached out to Lyana because we were friends. We had collaborated before. We did our PhDs kind of, at the same time in different departments. And and I said, what do you think about maybe working together and seeing what the nations want made?
Yeah, it's a good example too of how it's just there's a time and a place for everything, because I was really interested in when my dad Archie Patrick, who's also featured in the film, when he approached us about telling a story. And I think he was really he understood that this court case was a really unique story. It was the first time a nation had taken, as far as I know, I think, had taken industry directly to court for to be accountable, and the fact that the nations were seeking stewardship, of the water.
It was actually the case where it was proven that nations could actually sue a corporation. Before this case,
the first one.
Before this case, it wasn't proven in court that nations could actually sue corporations.
Wow.
Setting precedent for what was going to come afterwards. Hopefully coming afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think at the time we were thinking about, who was going to partner with us on this. And there were many nations that were impacted by that dam. And so we were trying to do that outreach and see who was going to, who wanted to be involved in that. And it just wasn't the right time. Yeah. And so later on, I think it just made a lot of sense that the fact that our nations were the ones in this court case, and that's what kind of anchored it.
Stellatin and SICA.
Yes,
yeah.
SICAs. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. For Jess, what were the key challenges maybe in structuring and producing a documentary with such a broad historical scope over such a large period of time? Because, as you've mentioned, the court case is providing a certain structure to the film, and there's so much more to explore. What was the approach there?
I mean, I think in a way this was Lyana's to weed through with a lot of care and a lot of attention towards, balancing, I think, what people in community were maybe hoping for and expecting alongside the vision that, that Lyana had for the film. I think for me, one of the kind of bigger challenges was really kind of thinking about how do you make a film that is partially about this court case without reifying the colonial courts as a space of justice for Indigenous nations, and without having that kind of court work dominate a context where there's been generations of resistance, and that has looked that has been scaled very uniquely, I think, right? From individual actions to these bigger pushes against industry in the community.
Well, even just watching the film and seeing that they, prove that you were on this land for, however long, it was just such a strange ask from the court. So it is interesting balancing or teetering the line between using these systems while also acknowledging their history of exclusion.
And can I just be frank, bureaucratic idiocy?
Yeah.
Well, anyways, not to be, well, maybe we'll edit that out.
And for Lyana, there were a lot of beautiful voices in this film, and I'm curious to know how you balanced telling both the environmental side of the story with the river and also the human story of these Indigenous communities and people within those communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I'm just thinking back to this document that Jess shared at the producing panel, which was part of DOXA. And we had met, and I hadn't looked at that in a long time, but it was all the notes of all the things that we were, wanting to hopefully get to when we told this story. And part of it was, the stories of this long struggle and of the generations of families that had engaged in different ways to restore the Nechako, as well as cumulative impacts, as well as, so there were all these things, and I think it's just kind of holding them in your mind and thinking about ways that you can, how do you tell a 70-year story in 90 minutes? You just have to kind of collapse things in a way, right?
Yeah.
So I think, it was a very intentional strategy. Like with our cinematographer, Sean Stiller, we talked a lot. Shout out to the beautiful cinematography and the work that he did.
Yes.
And also just like all this work that we did before filming started to meet to share our, what inspired us and what were we looking, what were we trying to go for. And so our conversations were really around, wanting to show that impact from the drone footage, right? And how also let's not overuse drone because drone has become
she's popular.
Yes. So how do you really carefully use that to maybe show when we have these big impacts, we're going to show that the drone, and then when we get into the intimacy of the stories, then we're just going to be with the people on the ground. And it was also really helpful to have this process that, again, I'll ask Jess to speak to this or to provide other details, but it was so important that we have all these processes built into the production and then post-production of getting community input and of meeting multiple times with community and of hearing what people also wanted to see and what maybe wasn't there at that rough cut stage.
So multiple community screenings.
Yes, and being very careful about how we structured that though as well. I think this is a really important piece of the story is that I think if you have a community-led and community-driven process, then it's really important to have some structure around that and understanding what everybody's responsibilities are going to be and what we're committing to and then what the community is also going to commit to. So I think that was just a really careful process, and there was an understanding that yes, I'm the director and have the creative vision, but at the same time, there's so many different people who are going to provide input into this. So I was just thinking about, for example, we had one community member who was like, there is not enough, there's so many animals in our territory, and they didn't see this necessarily reflected. And we were like, okay, we do need to show that, we've got these little scenes with the beaver and whatever. So I think it was just really this quite I think complex interplay of listening and responding and reflecting over the course of the years that we were making this.
5 years.
Yes.
Wow. Documentary.
Process long time.
That's so special, and it is a long time. It's a commitment. It takes me back to one of the questions that were at the producing panel, and I'd love if you could talk on this, Jess.
Also, shout out DOXA for having
for
the
panel
premiere on the 25th of April, and then also the co-producing. Well, I forget the exact title of what the panel was.
The producing panel.
Producing Nechako, yeah.
Producing
something
Nechako.
Producing Nechako, elevating Indigenous voices, or
something like
Something
that.
like that.
But exactly that.
Perfect.
If you could just talk a little bit more about the logistics of filming in northwestern British Columbia and collaborating with Indigenous nations, and also the ownership of the project and how that is structured.
I think usually, so I always start on a project by being invited in to work on something. And so I think that it's beautiful that this also started that way with an invitation in to do the work. And then usually one of the next questions I ask is, okay, what do you want from this? And in this case, one of the really early stages was really mapping out for the nations what different pathways to making this film could look like, and also what that would mean in terms of copyright and ownership of the film at the end. And through that process, we then settled on an understanding that the nations wanted to own the majority of the copyright of the film at the end of the day. And that started to structure what became a memorandum of understanding. And that memorandum of understanding was between Psychos and Stellat 10 and the production company that we formed to make the film. And I think really importantly, you know, there's like, just to kind of look back and think about these challenges. I mean, one challenge is that, you know, these nations are already dealing with so much. They're already dealing with so much. And so there's really a question of what is the capacity of a nation to hold a project, to host a film crew
For 5 years.
For 5 years, right?
Yeah.
Long time.
And what is that? And so often I kind of go in and I ask, like, what do you want? And then I also kind of determine, is there capacity on the ground? And part of the MOU is really about that, is the nations are appointing people in their communities who are going to kind of be the liaisons. And we're really, really lucky to have Jasmine Thomas play an epic.
She's incredible.
Shout out.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Because without Jasmine, this film would not have been made.
No.
Yeah, and so I think one is like that question of capacity. I think two is also this question of, you know, we still are operating within an elected band council system, an imposed colonial system of leadership within Indigenous nations. And so one of the other questions is, if you're invited in by one chief to make a film, and then the leadership changes, what are the community politics that can be at work in that context?
Yeah.
And how can you work to secure a space for that film and that director to be able to continue to hold that story and carry it forward, even though there might be an elected leadership change? That did happen in one of the nations, and it didn't happen in Psychos. So we worked with Chief Priscilla Mueller the whole time. But again, it's like, how can we make some of these understandings papered to ensure the kind of the stability of the project?
Yeah. Did the change in leadership have any impact on the filming process for you?
Yeah, I just think that there were absolutely challenges, especially for myself, making this in my own community, like that my family comes from, that I did not grow up in, that I've spent a lot of time there, but I didn't grow up there. Some people know me, some people don't know me, and there's a lot of challenges there with that that people may or may not be aware of. So I think that's that's part of it. Like I actually have to think more about what I want to say about that and how I say it, but I think it's
just different things to consider.
Yeah, it's something to reflect, I think, on as well, and just share more about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that part of this piece of it being community driven and being papered in a particular way is also a way of protecting you from, this is not you making unilateral decisions about who's in the film, about what the film is, about who owns it. This is really you in relationship in a whole variety of ways, so that at the end of the day, hopefully that mitigates some people asking questions around why did Lyana get to tell the story?
Yeah.
This is very true, and actually it's, you know, if somebody did want to ask those questions, like how is she benefiting from this, like why does she get to do these things, then we do have like really careful documentation about the whole process.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it is work that requires a lot of care and attention, and working to build those relationships.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of on a similar note, could you share a little bit about how the elders' knowledge was incorporated, and, you know, the oral histories that are also a key part of the documentary, and maybe what protocols were involved with that?
Yeah, I mean, that was also like over a long stretch of time. and just like consistently, I think, asking the communities, like, because, for example, Psych has had a whole department, an oral history department, but they also, and you can speak more to this, Jess, but they were open to us being able to access some of that, but there was also protocols around, which families, were like owned those oral histories, whose elders those were.
And we didn't get access.
No, we did not get access. Exactly. So
To any or to a lot?
to the psychos.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so the ones from the Still at 10, from my community, we did get permission to, we showed up at I think it was the language center, and found had a lot of different, like, found little recordings on VHS and on mini DV, I think, even, and cassette tapes. And so we were again given permission to take those and Lantern digitize them. And
the archival information or footage that you used in the film was...
It was incredible. It was incredible. And this was part of, too, when I would talk to community about the stories, because I did have people come up to me and like, oh, you have to talk about, you got to talk to this person about the Nechako, you got to do this. And I was like, and I said, yeah, absolutely. Like, there's so many stories. And I said, part of what this process is doing is also being able to make sure that people will have access to those stories. And so that, the kind of the archival piece was really important, being able to have that for the community.
Yeah, something that I really loved about the film, and I think, Georgia, you might have said this in one of the docs interviews, but the way that it didn't feel like sit down talking head interviews throughout the whole film. It was you and others learning about the Nechako through conversation, and us as the audience was able... Oh, you did say this. I think you were saying this at the panel.
Yes,
Regurgitating, but I just have to say, like, it just something about being a part of the process of discovery and a part of the process of understanding what was going on through talking with community members, and that was really beautifully done and very engaging.
Or I think too, like the scene with Jasmine sharing knowledge with her daughter, and then kind of the audience,
Mommy's going to court and we're doing this, and this is why.
Being partial to that as audience members was a really engaging way to bring it into. I mean, not that I'm not a fan of a talking head. It can serve a purpose, obviously, but it was definitely a...
Well, thank you. And that was a very intentional strategy.
That was leading into a question. I just fully stopped halfway, but I was going to ask, was that intentional? And also, when you were having initial conversations with people within the community, were you recording them? Were you having conversations and then coming back to that conversation on screen? How did that happen?
Exactly. Like, I think especially with the environmental monitors, we were, in fact... So in development, we spent quite a bit of time out with a couple of the environmental monitors, and I wanted the audience to experience what that was like. The joy, the humor, a lot of and that somewhat I think it does in a way come across, but of course the more you kind of... It's a tricky thing. Like, the more you get somebody to do that the first time, and then like asking them to recreate it.
It's hard, yeah.
And people moved in and out of positions. Like, some people were no longer working in those positions anymore by the time we were in production. So I felt like the dynamics that I had witnessed in development between people just wasn't there necessarily. And then Rodney emerged as a person that we really needed to spend time with and film with. So we definitely had conversations and revisited them. And then, from the beginning, though, I wanted to just really it to be very observational. But that was tricky as well, because especially in our first production trip, because I know, some of the people, so people wanted to talk to me and they wanted to tell me about things, but I was really conscious that it's not, I'm not coming in as a journalist, right? Like, I'm coming in partly to just show people, like, to share these stories, discover people and discover it through my connection. But then I just wanted the people to speak for themselves.
I think it definitely came across
100%.
through, like, personal perspectives, but it didn't feel aggressively pointed in one kind of way.
No, I
like,
loved it.
yeah. Really quickly going back, because with this archival component you guys were talking about at the panel, you have these oral histories that were being incorporated, and like you were just saying, on cassettes and those kinds of things. But then also featured in the film is is it CBC footage?
No, wasn't it NFB?
NFB.
It's
Yeah.
NFB, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about? There was a really funny joke you guys made. It was like maybe we'll edit this out. I don't know. So we made the joke of like, or the joke was made of like the reconciliation discount of getting the rights. For
You
the
said
NFB
Jess was like,
footage.
I got
I'm
in
not
trouble
gonna say
for
that.
saying
Oh,
that after.
Oh no!
Oopsies.
Okay, wait. So we'll cut this
No,
out.
it's okay. No, but I think it's important, right? Because I think
Yeah.
it's like when we're talking about reconciliation, we're not talking about words. We're talking about material
Actual action.
change,
Yeah.
action, reparations.
Mhm.
So we worked with an amazing visual archival researcher, Jennifer Chu, who basically identified, well, and you had done this work earlier as well, identified some very key early kind of propaganda films that were really supportive of the construction of the dam.
I think it's also important to note that NFB was one of the co-producers.
NFB was one of the co-producers
For
of the
Nechako.
film.
Or Nechako.
Yeah.
And the film that, one of the films that we found that was working really well in telling that early story, the early story of really what the narrative was that enabled this horror to be unleashed, was an NFB film.
Mhm.
And
So, yeah.
yeah. But archival documentaries are not documents. You should not trust the archival that you see.
Yeah.
So the audio that's underneath that is actually not from
the documentary.
that.
Whoa.
It's from
Okay.
another series of interviews that happened that were broadcast on the CBC.
Okay,
Okay,
so
I
it's
thought I
kind of
heard
a
CBC in
blend.
there.
Yeah.
And we needed to do that to clear, weirdly, that allowed us to clear insurance.
Okay.
Insurance for like
Errors and
and,
omissions
like,
insurance
yeah,
for the
okay.
film.
Right.
Based on
We couldn't get rights
Like-
to the audio.
We couldn't get rights to the script,
Couldn't get-
and we couldn't get rights to
Of the old NFB films.
So the old NFB film, the visuals we could get rights to.
Yeah.
Okay.
The script, right? It's
like the
narrated.
narrator. Yeah.
So the narrator, that's a voice actor.
yeah, we needed
and
to go
the
connect
script
with a
is written.
voice actor. from
okay, and
the
you couldn't get
And
permission
no,
from
we Jennifer found his estate
She did.
and thought that we could get a release. But the problem is that it was still under copyright.
Oh.
So it was decided. So we actually tried a lot of different things.
I
We tried
remember.
rewriting it, and then we were going to try to hire a voice
I
actor.
remember this,
Wow.
yeah.
And then eventually, I had identified some early CBC kind of news features about the construction of the dam, and so I asked Jennifer to pull them.
That because it fits so well.
Yeah.
You know,
I
the
would've
images,
never
I mean,
known.
them
I would've been none
explaining
the wiser.
certain locations and you can see on the map. So props. That was
Brilliant.
And
Yes.
then I think Martina
Yes.
actually went through the transcript and
through the
Frankenstein
Producing,
it all
yeah.
together.
Producing.
And
Wow.
in post production with the audio, we're like, okay, just try to like match up these levels. And
oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
it was
But we did have to pay
Amazing.
the National Film Board to license the footage.
Right.
There's another film I love called 3000 by Asinayak, and that is a full NFB production. And Asinayak basically, who's Inuk, goes through the whole NFB archive and kind of recasts the white gaze of that archive through their gaze.
Whoa.
And Asinayak had to also have in their budget the archival.
And was it also produced by the NFB?
Yes.
Interesting.
Wow.
So I'm
Interesting.
told that this is a much more kind of complicated structural thing about heritage and et cetera. But this is, archives continue to be a problem. They're in terms of even getting access, this, the CBC, how things are even tagged. It's
Yeah.
a big reckoning moment for archives right now, I think.
You touched on insurance. I don't know how much you can say, but this film, I know you had to do your due diligence in making sure that you were all cleared and not, defaming any major company in particular. talking about Rio Tinto and all of that within the documentary. What was the process, the legal process of the documentary specifically, and insurance? Was it more expensive? Was it harder to get?
Yes, please.
I'll field this one. Well, we had budgeted a lot for legal fees
Yeah.
in the budget because we knew we would need to be talking with our amazing lawyer, Nathaniel Lyman, a lot. For most, telefilm, most broadcasters, you're required to get errors and omissions insurance.
Yeah.
And that is a really stringent process of making sure that all of your paperwork is complete and done to the utmost kind of detail, including location releases, likeness releases, archival clearances, all of that. But what we did do early on is we had early conversations with Nate about
Shout out Nate.
yeah,
Shout out Nate.
Lantern's
Nate.
lawyer.
About what this would look like and how we could kind of get away with making, it's a film that's about the largest mining company in the world. And really, what is on record in terms of what their operations on the Nechako, how those have impacted community, right? And so because there was already this court case where there had been over 200 days of public hearings that are accessible,
Right.
it is considered on the public record already.
Yeah.
And so then it really became a question of, is there anything in the film that is said that has not already been said in the public record, including those 200 days of testimony?
Yeah.
The lawyers in the film did have kind of additional measures of approving their own, how they're represented, because they needed to be very careful as legal counsel for the nations that they were not saying something that would then potentially further
That might not have been on the
undermine
record or, yeah.
another case. But yeah, so that's basically, and we would send Nate a rough cut and he would take a look and just kind of advise on what would be, what he would think would clear the errors and omissions process. But at the end of the day, we did have some difficulty getting the insurance.
Wow. Yeah.
The insurers were concerned that the risks were too high.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's where Nate came in and just was, very clear that he disagreed and felt that this was actually quite a low risk film. And so we got the insurance. But that's why I work with lawyers, work with them early, work with them
Always,
throughout. Even though they're
always.
expensive, it's totally
It's worth it. Even when we started Film Picnic, we had no money, but we made sure that we
Right.
paid a
We were
lawyer
like,
to
let's
have a
have a
contract
contract.
for us
Yeah.
and for any whatever.
Other operations
Anything
and
else.
things. Well, can I just say, this might even sound silly, but
No, Georgia.
in
This is a
the
safe space.
well, oh, thank you. I mean, yeah, just like, obviously this film is about the bureaucratic process of, fighting against the colonial power, and even just talking about the bureaucratic processes that you're like coming up against in the filmmaking process. Like, thank you for continuing to do it. Thank you for making this film happen.
Yeah.
I'm very glad it exists, and I know other people are glad it exists.
Yeah.
It feels like an obvious statement, but yeah, I don't know. In case no one said it to you, thank you for
Well, yeah.
continuing to do the work.
Thank you. And I do think that work is absolutely like game changing. I really do. It's like it's a mode of practice and a way of making films that needs to be like very front and center.
Yeah,
and it needs to be just the way things are done.
I think especially with kind of the sharing of ownership of the film, that's something that you really don't see. And,
Absolutely. Well, we have this academic background as well,
which is awesome.
Featured in the intro.
Yes.
We'll talk all about now. No.
Go ahead.
I mean, no, there's practices that are shifting and changing as well. There's this thing called OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, possession of research. And it's particularly in Indigenous health research, it's like who owns it, who controls it, who has access, who physically possesses
Yeah.
this data. And it's just like many of us are like, it's just not acceptable anymore. You can't just come in. It can't be extractive.
No.
There has to be meaningful changes in how people are benefiting from these processes, who's doing the work and why, and all that good stuff. And so I feel like the same thing can and should be said about film and documentary film, not just with Indigenous communities, but probably a lot of different communities. Like,
Yeah.
who is benefiting from these stories being told? How is this film being told? What happens in the aftermath?
Where's the money going?
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I don't think it can be business as usual. Like, and I know it's tough anyways. I know it's hard to make documentary films in the best of times, but I think it's just like there has to be people who show leadership in changing the stories.
And documentary is why I got into film in the first place.
Hey.
I didn't intend to end up in documentary, but I watched documentaries as, you know, a young teenager and really changed my perspective on a lot of things, and in different industries. And I saw the impact that could have, and I was like, I want to do that. So yeah.
Yeah. Really quickly, can I also ask, like you were talking about the memorandum of understanding, is that something, how long has that been a practice in your filmmaking experience, and do you think it's becoming more normative?
I mean, in a way, I stole that from planning. So in planning,
From community.
well, from community planning,
Yeah.
stole it from planning. No,
Okay.
I mean, when you do community planning, you have memorandums of understanding, you have community benefit agreements, you have contracts. You have contracts that are really outlining the relationship between different parties, and you know, a contract is a reflection or an outline of what your shared understanding is of these questions that go back to OCAP, right?
Yeah.
So I have used MOUs before in film work. I had never used a community benefit agreement before, which is a really, you know, it's a substantial document that really actually says, this is how much we're going to pay people in community. This is how you're going to build the advisory for the film. This is who's going to be on it. You know, this is what you're giving us in kind in terms of filming on the reserve. This is what we'll be providing back to you in terms of archives. So it's really going into all of these shared pieces. And then from the MOU and from the CBA, we then created separate contracts with each crew member. So everybody who also signed a crew deal memo signed onto a version of that memorandum of understanding, and then also signed onto another kind of just general document about what it means to show up in community and what some of the shared understandings of like, what does respect in this context look like, just to make sure that we were all on the same page with what that, because it also shifts and moves, right, depending on whose land you're on.
Yep.
And so I think that was also really great that was kind of co-developed in the process of making the film.
Wow.
I love it.
I love it too. I would encourage them to be used more, and they are available actually on the Nechako website.
Shout out Nechako. What's the URL?
NechakoRiver.ca. You can go there and you can actually download, with permission from the NFB and the Nechako Nations, the redacted versions of the Community Benefit Agreement and the Memorandum of Understanding.
That is so amazing.
That's amazing. Yeah. Wow.
Emerging filmmakers,
Resource dropped.
yes, use it. I think this might be a nice spot to just take a quick break, and we can come back for the
We'll
last.
come right back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Again.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. Yeah, we were just talking a little bit about, bureaucratic processes, amongst other things.
Yeah. I'm going to ask this question. You don't have to answer it. For Lyana and also for Jess. But how does Nechako connect to global patterns of resource extraction affecting Indigenous communities like Rio Tinto's actions in Australia, and maybe threats to Apache sacred lands?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think that people watching this film in other parts, certainly of BC and certainly of Canada, are going to really find familiar themes. I think they're going to really recognize their own experience with not just metal and mining companies, or aluminum, but with other resource extraction industries and the kinds of ways in which they've both been excluded from benefiting from that, and as well as suffering from the destruction and devastation of their lands and waters. So because I have had my own interest in this from telling the story, from learning about industry and its impacts. So I have been much more attentive to how, particularly certain companies' actions outside of Canada have impacted Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And so I think these are really important stories to tell. And I think they're also really important spaces for solidarity and really deeply exploring the different strategies that communities and nations are using. Ours is a legal strategy, but in the film we also show how people are continuing to use, even when there's no fish in the river. People are still going out there and still practicing, because that is our connection, right? Is how we do those things.
I mean, I think that one of the parts I really like about this film is that it's tying let me just reset this. So within settler colonial contexts, it's land that is of value, right? And land has value when you push the Indigenous people off of it. And so much of that story is tied up with ensuring that people are off the water and ensuring that you can control the water so that you can put roads in. And then that really opens up the territory to all of these different industries, all these different ways of extracting from that land. And what I think the film does really well is it tells that story in part. And so I think that it is also kind of thinking of, this global context that still exists of Indigenous people being torn away from the land, and that land then being captured for capital in different kinds of ways, in ways that are always violent. And in ways that are also really violent in terms of how they sit in people's bodies. So how is that extraction and that fight against it worn by people in community? How is it held and worn by Jasmine, who is already kind of embroiled in this context of raising the next generation, raising her kids in the way that she was raised, in the way that her ancestors were raised, while also at the same time having to go to the courts, having to be in these meetings, having to be on Zoom. And so I think it's really about the intimacy of what those impacts are in people's daily lives, as well as on the land.
I think a very striking image for me was seeing the beautiful archival footage of fishing on the river and how many salmon there were. Like, it was insane. And then we get to see you in present day fishing and only one coming out. And I think that, to me, I was like, oh my God, that's a very tangible,
quantifiable.
Yes.
I think, and I think a good example of like kind of, I keep describing it as like collapsing. So like these really complex things that Jessica just like described, I think is like resides in that.
Yeah.
And it also resides in Jasmine and in Jasmine's story and in, her, expressing what it's like to leave her children and have to go down to Vancouver and meet with the chiefs and meet with the ministers. And that's, I think these are really important. It's a really important theme. And it's one thing that I think also resonated in terms of going back to, again, like my experience in academia, is that there is an expectation that the mainstream like Western methodologies of how to do work and how to do research and how to teach and how to do all the things. And you also know your Indigenous ways, that you have connections to community and you have all of these careful community relationships. And so doing all of it is utterly exhausting and not sustainable. And this is how I feel with the people in community who've been leading these struggles and fights. It's like, it's exhausting and it causes and it resides it ends up in the body and
Mhm.
expresses itself. And
Yeah, even in watching Jasmine, I'm kind of careful to. I mean, she is such a strong woman, but I'm kind of almost careful to describe her as such because she shouldn't have to be. But just, watching her and all of the hats that she wears and everything that she does is just incredible, inspiring, and unfathomable.
Yeah, it is remarkable.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, there were moments I think some people say, oh, the hallmark of a good film is if you can laugh and you can cry. And I don't know, I certainly encountered both of those in Nechako.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously it's a good film, but
Duh.
I think, the watching her be on Zoom and they were getting the results back in from the hearing that they had been to, and watching relief manifest on their faces in tears was so deeply moving and a beautiful image. I have a question about distribution. Now that this film exists,
Another one for you,
Lyana
Jess.
puts her mic down.
no, well, hey, I mean, we both
eventually
try.
I'll take over on that.
Well, just now that it's been such a long process, it's been so many years of filming and putting together, and then you guys had a lovely premiere on the 25th at the Doxa Film Festival. Now that it exists and it's out in the world, what is the distribution strategy to ensure that it reaches audiences who it resonates with and audiences who can contribute to meaningful change?
So our distributor is the National Film Board.
Shout out.
And the next up, so really what's being planned is a small festival run, which is happening now. The film is going to Sydney.
Shout out. Sydney, my old stomping grounds.
And then we'll have a theatrical run at VIF at the beginning of June.
Amazing.
And that will then be followed by community screenings. So communities who want to have the film can request it from the National Film Board.
Mm-hmm.
And the National Film Board will kind of set up everything that's needed to have that community screening. At some of those screenings, people from the film or involved in its making may be in attendance. So that is something else. You can go to nechakoriver.ca and request a screening.
Yeah, the email too is communityscreenings@nfb.ca.
Okay.
So you can email them directly, and they're very responsive, and they will help to set those up.
Mm-hmm.
But part of, actually, this is why you should also be talking about this, because early on, you really made some very strong connections with health organizations in British Columbia, who are also going to be our impact partners to ensure that this really does get out in the ways that I think, Lyana, you were really envisioning in terms of sparking these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this came about in part because of some of the financing that we were applying for early on, and they wanted to know kind of what our plan was for that longer term impact, and so my through my connections with SFU and people I've been working with over the last couple of years, we connected with First Nations Health Authority and the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. So just thinking about the different folks who have a real vested interest in this and can help us to amplify and support the message.
Is there an avenue for this film being in schools?
Why, yes, there is. What can I say, though?
Yeah, there is. Well, the NFB right now have kind of shifted their relationship to educational with in general at the NFB. The NFB used to be kind of very heavily in the educational quote market. They're less involved in that, or that their relationship has shifted, I should probably say. But we have been having ongoing conversations with the Downey Wenjack Foundation to have the film go into schools next year. And of course, there's also the university context, so Canopy and the NFB has those relationships. But really, like, the strategy is always, right? It's always festivals, and then it's theatrical, then it's community screenings, and then it's your broadcast windows, and then it's online. And when it's online and accessible on the NFB's website, that is really when the educational will start in earnest.
That's when it opens up.
Can I ask quickly, at the, maybe it was at the premiere or the producers panel, I don't remember which, it was said that a team that you had connected with at Rio Tinto
had
Oh,
seen
that was
the
at the
film.
screening.
At what point was that connection made, and at what point were they viewing the film also?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that we talked throughout the process of making this film about whether Rio Tinto was, you know, whether we told them about it, what kind of presence they had in the film, and it was very much focused on Nechako nations, and so there was no, we didn't kind of reach out to anybody. And it was more, to my mind, I just always wondered if they would at some point hear about this somehow. But also I think, over the last, at the same time that we were making this film, as my dad, as Archie says in the film, from the beginning of this, the communities were also trying to have like a negotiation and talk to them. And so that never really ended. That never really stopped. The communities have always kept an open dialogue.
Yeah.
So we knew that, there were things happening. And, I think the job for this film was to, show the court case and preparations around that and people involved with that. And just this larger history of that river and of our nations and of our lands and waters. So, I think that's, that was, I think, rightfully where the focus was.
What I can say is that Jasmine Thomas made the decision as part of what Lyana shared.
Yeah.
Around of course, the nations are always in a conversation or in a process with all of these companies that are in their territory, including Rio Tinto. And so Jasmine made the decision as, as part of her job with the nations, was she thought it was really important that some of the people she has been working with from Rio Tinto see the film before it premiered at Doxa. And Jasmine ensured that they were sent a secure link and that they watched it. And anything more about that, you can for sure talk to Jasmine about. But they did see it ahead of the premiere.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of it all, it's like these are complex conversations. And I mean, I guess in film, certainly in news style pieces, it tends to be very reductionist, and it's like black and white, and it's absolutely not. Like, there's just way more layers to this than you can get in a 2-minute clip or even a 90-minute film.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I also think that we exist in a context now where it's becoming increasingly harder for academics to do mining research because they're getting sued. It's becoming increasingly harder to have big investigative news pieces, right? Because of who is controlling the news.
Yes.
And so I think that the space, but I also think the space for documentaries that are doing political work is also being foreclosed by fear from festivals around protests, around different, people with different opinions being upset that a film has been programmed. And so I do think that the space that Nechako is taking is really important, because we are getting less and less of this really kind of deep analysis.
Yeah. I think we're down to our final few questions.
We could talk for so long.
I know. The film is described as a call to action. What specific version of co-management and stewardship do you hope that viewers will support after watching Nechako?
What version of it?
Or what do you hope that looks like for someone who might maybe be outside of the community watching Nechako and wanting to support or be an ally? What are you hoping? What actions do you think that would be possible for them?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, signing a petition, joining
on the website.
Yeah,
There's an action button on the website.
Yeah.
It's got a petition and a spot to donate.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, so I think for sure doing those things, writing letters, to their MP, their MLA, encouraging that, because as we have said in other spaces, it's really incumbent now upon federal and provincial governments to come to the table to ante up the resources, and that's what is really going to push this over the line in terms of stewardship. But I think also just really people considering their relationships with the places that they are living on, and I really reflect a lot very personally on this when I was coming back from these production trips, even for myself. Like I would notice like streams that I hadn't noticed before in like the Lower Mainland, and I was just like, I don't know, it opened my eyes up in different ways, and it made me really think about my responsibilities to the lands that I am on and the waters that I'm on. So, there's river protectors and there's like all sorts of different spaces that people are actually working really hard with other community groups and with nations to, to do this kind of work, to do this restoration work. So I just really hope people are inspired to do that in their communities.
Yeah.
I also think it's important to not, like, just because Rio Tinto Alcan were not found liable, I think it's really important to keep talking about Rio Tinto Alcan.
Yeah.
And what they're doing and where, and to be sharing that information. Because the reality is that, if there is a shift in that relationship, that's great. And part of that shift is from the ongoing pressure
From everyone.
Common
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah.
The power that has.
Do you mind if I ask a final question, unless you have another one?
Well, I have a question I want to ask.
Go
that
ahead.
I just
Please go.
I'm interested in knowing the answer to.
Bless you.
It was so beautiful. Han and I got to be at the premiere at Doxa, and the many
At the VIF Center.
At the VIF Center, many of the community members in the film were there, and that was just, it was beautiful for us to kind of witness those relationships, and I don't know, it felt like there was magic in the air, like it was so special. But I don't know, have either of you encountered a piece of feedback or feedback or response from your community that's been particularly meaningful for you since, I guess either during the process of this or since the film has been completed?
I definitely have. I had a family member come up to me, a close family member come up after actually our community screenings that we had a few weeks before the premiere. And he was so moved by it. And he just, said, this is such an important story. He's like, you don't know how big this is and how important this is. And he was just, and I had never seen this family member be moved in this way. And I was just like, yeah, I just, it meant everything. It meant everything to me. In fact, those community screenings were like the most important audience there was. I was incredibly nervous before those screenings.
Yeah.
And it just like, it was so beautiful. And that's what was most important to me, was that people resonated. And
Yeah, I think you're right. It felt really special opening night. It felt really, magical.
Yeah, it was.
And I think, so something Jasmine said to me was that it was so important for people from community to be able to come together and celebrate. That gatherings that are about celebrating are rare. And I was talking with another filmmaker I'm working with now, Siku Alulu.
Shout out.
Yeah, Siku's amazing. And Siku hasn't seen the film, but Siku knows what the film is about. And she reflected something to me that I thought was really interesting too, was that when you're in the struggle, this is a 70-year struggle, when you're in the struggle, it's also rare to have that lifted up and publicly kind of celebrated. Like this moment in time that was a really important moment. A lot of rights were won by the Nechako nations in this court case. And of course the battle continues, but that opportunity to celebrate people like Jackie, like your dad, it doesn't happen that often. And it's really, I think that was part of that magic, is when a film can actually do that, it's huge.
Yeah. Very special.
It then means a film is also part of the struggle in that way, right?
Yeah.
Which is just precisely what, I don't know. I feel like if I had created
I don't
something
know.
like that, I'd be patting myself on the back for a long time.
Yeah.
As you both should be.
A
please.
final question.
Yeah.
Film Picnic is catered towards emerging filmmakers, and so I'm curious if either of you would have any advice for filmmakers who are trying to get into documentary, particularly wanting to work and uplift marginalized communities, whether they're a part of that community or coming in from the outside.
Yeah, just listen to everything we
Yeah.
take notes.
What we already said.
Earlier about that kind of careful community work, but also, I mean, I would say just for my own personal experience, like I wish I'd had like a mentor and a confidence and belief and a community earlier in my career, because I probably would have dedicated my life to this as opposed to doing a lot of other things, which I'm glad I did. It led me to where I am at. But at the same time, I feel like those things were really crucial, and I did not see myself represented in kind of mainstream, film and video. And so I think just really, finding your people and not settling for feeling. If you don't feel safe, if it doesn't feel right, then protect yourself, and it's not acceptable to have to put up with that to tell a story. I don't know. Period.
I agree.
I mean, I think for me, there's kind of two pieces to this. One is that I'm always thinking, how does my access, how does my privilege, how does my labor, intellectual and otherwise, in the service of. So materially, what is this doing, right? Which is why this process that we've talked about today was so important. But the other piece I've learned, or I'm still learning and may never fully learn, is to really look for and listen for no's. A no.
Yeah.
And a no that may not be an audible no, but a silence or a gap or an omission or not getting back to you. And I think I have been in situations where I've pushed, and I've learned that if I'm pushing, it's not the right thing. It's not the right story. It's not the right relationship. And I think, as a white person, as a pretty privileged white person, learning to make the space for a no has been really, really important.
I love that. Yeah.
Consent. And I still and it's still something that I'm figuring out, right?
Yeah.
Words of wisdom.
Yes.
Absolute wisdom in the studio right now.
Yes. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and taking the time.
For sharing your thoughts.
An hour and a half.
Well, thank you for your really thoughtful questions. And it's nice to have this kind of expansive space to
elaborate.
And
Yeah.
I really appreciate that you've created this. Yeah.
And Film Picnic, amazing.
Yay!
Really, really,
Shout
really
out.
important.
Shout out! We're trying to do something here.
Yeah.
I think the something's working.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
thank you. This is also the first. We didn't even mention this. This is the first time we've put 2 couches in the studio today.
They
How do we
fit.
feel about the vibe?
It's lovely.
In the
I love
setup?
it.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
Roasty. We're
Yeah,
hot.
it's
No,
hot
it is
in
hot
here.
here, y'all. It's real
We'll
hot.
figure out the aircon
Oh,
situation.
yeah. One day.
Otherwise,
One day.
Oh my gosh.
Um,
Listeners, please enjoy the rest of your day. Don't forget to check us out at FLM Picnic on Instagram, or you can find us on Spotify at Film Picnic, or you can find us on the CITR website at citr.ca/radio/film-picnic.
also, don't forget to check out Nechako at nechako.ca.
NechakoRiver.ca.
NechakoRiver.ca. We will see you next time on Film Picnic as we continue debunking the film industry with meaningful conversation, one picnic at a time.